Hello, my name is Dr. Elizabeth Spalding, and I am Vice Chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. VOC, as it's known, is an educational, human rights, and research nonprofit that's located in Washington, D.C. We have a new museum, the Victims of Communism Museum, so please come and see that. And it is my honor today to introduce to you our Director of Academic Programs, Mr. Ken Pope, who's going to be talking about a very important and timely topic, Putin's war on Ukraine and the West. And I'm sure that Mr. Pope will be introducing himself a bit more, sharing some things with you, but I just want to tell you that you are in for a treat today because Mr. Pope brings to this subject not only education and academic knowledge, but also professional and personal background. So without further ado, I turn this over to Ken Pope. Ken?
All right. Thank you, Elizabeth. I really appreciate the introduction. So I'll go ahead and start with, like, as Dr. Spalding mentioned, just a little background about myself. So I come mainly from the intelligence world when I was on active duty in the U.S. Army. So I spent most of my time on the intelligence side collecting information, first as a reconnaissance officer, then as a special operations officer, and then as a Russian foreign area officer. I had numerous assignments in that part of the world, in that region, Ukraine. I had 2 stints there, traveled all over and extensively in Russia, even got to deploy with a Russian airborne battalion to Kosovo for about 5 months. And then when I retired, I worked in the consulting world a bit, and then I taught at the university level, teaching intelligence and national security studies. And again, most of that focused on Eastern Europe and Russia. And now, as Dr. Spalding mentioned, I am part of VOC and enjoying my time there. So let's go to the next slide and get started. Okay, so I like to, when I talk about Russia, I like to talk about there's always more to this story than readily meets the eye. And I'll use this experience I had as a START mission commander, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty commander, traveling into Russia. So I was at this site where they had this particular weapon system called the Russian Road Mobile ICBM SS-27. Very unique system. It's very capable, can park a warhead not too far away from where Dr. Spalding and I currently sit in the DC area, to about 7,000 miles away. It's manned by some of their best soldiers, their strategic rocket forces. And we worried about this a great deal during the Cold War. When I was there during this particular visit, it was a rainy, cold, windy day. And typically the Russians did not want us looking around and seeing anything other than that particular piece of equipment, not the inside of that garage behind it. But in that garage, we happened to catch it when some of the signage blew away. The covers for the signage blew away, and there was that sign right there in the little red box that said, "Warning, do not drink the wiper fluid." So think about that for a second. You got this country who can produce this massive weapon system, very accurate, very powerful, train their soldiers to do it, field it to the tune of millions and millions of rubles or trillions of rubles even, but they have to warn their people not to drink wiper fluid. So there's more to the story there than meets the eye. So something is wrong in that system that they have to warn them. And that's kind of how I like to describe this thing called Russia. There's always more to the story than meets the eye. And let's get into the topic about Putin and his war on Ukraine. So go to the next slide, please. So I like to start with this is typically some of the arguments you see or hear is it our fault in the West? Can we force Russia into this by, having more people join NATO and the like? And my answer to that question is both yes and no. So we'll start with a no first. I tend to agree with the historian Stephen Kotkin, and based on my own experiences traveling around Russia and getting to know Russian people. And that assumes a lot. First point was it assumes that had NATO not existed or expanded, that Russia wouldn't be the same as it is today. Russian history really doesn't support that assumption. The pattern in Russian rule hasn't changed much since the first Tsarist period. Think about Ivan the Great, the gentleman there, or Ivan the Terrible rather, there at the bottom left, or Stalin, or Putin today. The picture of Stalin is interesting. That was taken in 2018 from a group of people who were marching in support of wanting that way back in life. So It's the system that I would always tell my friends that not much has changed about Russia and how it's ruled since the first czar and since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia then and through today has had this authoritarian ruler, be it Ivan the Terrible or Stalin or Putin, that's repressive. The country's repressive, militant, imperial, distrustful of the West and foreigners in general. So not really so much a response to the West, but who they are as a people and culture, typically controlled by an authoritarian or totalitarian ruler as the norm. Let's go to the next slide. So talking about the affirmative, the yes to this question. So yes, NATO did expand. If you look at the map you have on the screen to your left, you see it from the Russian perspective, Russia or the Soviet Union being in blue and how NATO in red kind of expanded up closer to its border. That is in fact true. But there's a reason for that. These countries in East and Central Europe, and especially the former Soviet republics, they want no part of Russia for the very reasons we talked about. It's very repressive. They don't trust Russia. They fear it in many cases. And in some cases, they just loathe them based on their personal experiences with that country, the guys in charge of it specifically. And we'll discuss some of those in just a few minutes. Let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about Russia and Russian rulers. So they're typically, like any other authoritarian or totalitarian ruler, they understand and respect one thing, and that's power. They wield it very often mercilessly in their own nations, and they tend to few those who don't or aren't unwilling to use their power like that as weak, especially superpowers like the United States. And weakness to them says one thing, and that one thing is opportunity. So Putin saw in the West, saw us as reliant on his oil, especially Europe and the US to some degree. He saw the US as weak. And with every provocation or troop increase along the border, if you think about the current conflict when they led up to the invasion, we really did nothing. When we do nothing, when Russia conducts, say, for example, going back to 2007, a cyber attack on Estonia, or he murders his political opponents or those who criticize him in the United Kingdom, or we ignore the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, or when he invades and then annexes Crimea in 2014, and now he invades Russia. And the best we can do is kind of chastise Putin. You know, we say, you know, President Biden was famous for saying, we don't want to provoke him or bring a war with Russia in the US. Or if you're like President Obama said, you're on the wrong side of history when he invaded Crimea and took that over. Or George W. Bush, when he said, I can see into Putin's soul. That most assuredly is going to provoke an action. And it's going to provoke him to want to take more. Because when we tell him that we don't want to provoke, that's provoking an action. I'm relatively sure some of those comments, you know, Vlad and his inner circle, they kind of got a chuckle out of that. That's all it's going to cost me. That's all they've got. It tells them that they're afraid of me. They're not going to do anything. So when we react or react weakly, we're losing to him, period. So you pick the domain that we kind of talk about at the geopolitical level: military, information, diplomatic, economic. We give way too much to Putin far too early and far too often. And as a result, his appetite tends to grow. So let's go to the next slide. So why is Putin at war with Ukraine? Again, it's kind of a complex question that requires, you know, a good deal of thought. So I've had the good fortune to be able to travel all over Russia, really from St. Petersburg in the, if you look over to the western part of the country, all the way out to the east in Kamchatka and everywhere in the middle. It's a wonderful, amazing country. I mean, the people there are wonderful people, just like anywhere else. And like a lot of cultures, especially in Western Europe, you can make a lifelong friend with a Russian pretty quickly. Just over a glass of vodka or a drink, you can become very tight once you break through the shell. They have a great culture in the arts, the literature, but Russia and Russians are very different than we are in the West. They are not like us. They view the world very differently than we do. And they tend to have this paranoia about the West, US, and foreigners in general. And they have this fear of being persecuted, and they think they are on the world stage. Where we fail is we fail to understand them because we in the US especially, we tend to mirror. And what do I mean by that? So by mirroring, we take, because we're Americans, we think everything we do is great and wonderful. Therefore, everybody wants to be like us and probably will do the same thing that we do in any given situation. that is dangerous. That is not how the Russians view the world. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So while I do appreciate and admire the Russian culture and the people, I loathe the government, having worked against it or with it on occasion when things were good. But those in power in particular, they're typically a totalitarian. Pick your guy, pick it, be it a Lenin, a Stalin, a Khrushchev, or a Putin. They all have this desire to be the great power, but they just can't seem to get there due to a host of issues. Think back again about that first slide I showed you, talking about the missile system and the guys having to drink wiper fluid there and why that takes place. They can't seem to make it all work for reasons that we're going to discuss as we go through this. One of the huge factors, but not the key factor, is the economy. Russia has a fabulous amount of wealth in a lot of areas, mainly centered in Moscow and St. Pete, but elsewhere it's just a lot of poverty. Their military bases, as Dr. Spalding and I have spoken a couple of times, they're abysmal. I mean, just to live there would be horrific. I've visited both Russian military bases and visited a couple of times U.S. prisons, and I swear I would rather live in a U.S. prison than some of the military bases I've lived on in Russia. It's that bad. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so let's talk about the Russian economy. I like to view this both in terms of GDP with some numbers, but also making a comparison with automobiles, one of my topics I like to talk about. So let's take a look at the US GDP, very large, about $25 trillion. And if you look at what the share of that per citizen is, it's about $66,000. And we have a large defense budget. And as a result, we can afford to make a sports car that we have here in the US, the Corvette. We can make a lot of them. And if you think about that as similar to our military, we can make a lot of really good vehicles, a lot of good things, and we have enough to go around, right? If you think about the Italians, for example, I've worked with their military before. They have a smaller GDP and a smaller per capita GDP. I mean, their defense budget is kind of small too, but think about the car they make. They can make a really good Ferrari. Not a lot of people can afford it. And similar to their military, they don't have a lot of military, but what they have is very good and very competent. Let's go to Russia now. GDP smaller than Italy, a small country, right? Their per capita, what the individual citizen gets is even less, less than a third of what Italy has. In their defense budget, they like to make it look like this great Maserati, this fast sports and flashy sports car, but that's really not the reality. Build the next slide, Elliot, please. Okay, what they really have is that. It's a Zhiguli. It's a really kind of a piece of a junk car. It gets the job done per se, and they strap a lot of neat things on it to make it look fierce and fast, but it's really not. So their economy is really tied to oil in a lot of cases, in most cases. That's where they get most of it from. But they just don't have the economy to manage the size of the military that they have. So if you think of the United Kingdom, they have a $71 billion defense budget. In a very small military, but it's professional and it's competent. That is not the Russian military. It's large and not really competent. So their economy, again, tied to exports. They sell a lot of military equipment, but nobody really wants to buy the stuff they're selling now. And because of what they're doing, the performance of their military in this war, they're not likely to sell a lot of it in the future. So the problem starts with their ruling structure. It squanders the enormous wealth and natural resources that they have on all the wrong things. First and foremost, on themselves, the people on top, and their security services and their military, corruption. So meaning that goal of becoming the great power always eludes them. They try to force it through state-led violence at home and abroad with intimidation. And that may work at home and abroad for a while, but eventually it just slows everything down. It slows progress toward meeting their goals on the world stage. So they spend a lot creating the wrong stuff. A strong state, strong military services, strong security service, which in turn just continues to push the goal of being on par with the US and with China farther and farther away. The Russian state just simply can't seem to make it all work and all work the right way. And it's all revolves around this totalitarian or authoritarian ruler and keeping him in power. And while Russia is a great power, it is not the great power and likely can never get there. Let's go to the next slide. So the real problem is what I like to call the Russian way. And the Russian way is the authoritarian or totalitarian state. And I'll talk about the wheel and the folks on the screen in just a second. So what they really have is a state that's designed to keep the tyrant they have at the top in charge through the power ministries. So a lot of people talk about, well, if we could put pressure on the oligarchs, that will turn things around. They'll start doing things better. That's really not the case. Oligarchs really that are there or left standing are Putin's oligarchs. They have no control. The inner circle and the people who really matter are the intel and the security services. The FSB has a force, think of that like your FBI and Homeland Security. Over 250,000 people work there. There's strategic or their SVR, their other foreign intelligence service, large as well. They also have a National Guard of about 400,000, not in the sense that we have, but in the sense that that's Putin's personal bodyguard, whose job is to keep him in power. Okay. That's where it all rotates around. And think about those numbers with a population of about 145 million. Of course, he also has the MOD, the military services. The people who run these services are Putin's handpicked cronies, those guys around the wheel you see up there. And they all come from the same place in the main, which is the intelligence and security services. That's the people he trusts and where Putin came from. And they rely on him in turn for power, position, and Putin's checkbook, which is, believe it or not, the Russian economy. Everything revolves around this guy. The intelligence community, both old and new, controls or has significant influence over all aspects of the government, but also all major private enterprise in the country. And Putin has populated a lot of the regional power positions. Think of the governors across the 88 different republics that he has there, all his guys, again, mainly former KGB or FSB guys. And if you think about it this way, 3 out of 4 of the senior government officials or current or former intelligence or security officers, 40% of the Russian bureaucracy and 60% of his administration all have intel or security backgrounds. So as the totalitarian in charge, he is the ultimate decision maker. And the power ministries think they're Congress, the Duma. They appear to rubber stamp whatever he decides in the main. I really didn't completely buy into that until we saw what happened right before Putin went into Ukraine, when you got the guy up here with the red arrow pointing to him, his SVR chief, his foreign intelligence chief, Sergei Naryshkin, when he kind of browbeat this guy into submission on global TV about the invasion. He had some doubts. Putin told him to get over his doubts and make a decision. So when I saw that, I think something's changed with this guy. He's decided he's no longer interested in what his intelligence guys are saying to him. And that is a recipe for an intelligence failure and a military disaster. Some of that he got in spades when he went into Ukraine. So let's talk about what prompted him to go in. So let's go to the next slide. So let's go back a little bit and talk about Putin's formative years. So he grew up in a world characterized by state violence and taking what you can, as you see from our 2 folks on the screen here. So let's talk about Sorokin first. He had just a wonderful quote that really summarizes, like few places I've ever seen, the nature of the Soviet Union. As a child, I perceived violence as a sort of natural law, and the totalitarian Soviet Union oppression held everything together. It was a sinister energy of our country. Think about growing up in a world like that. And further expounded upon by the great Solzhenitsyn, when he said the very ideology of communism, all of Lenin's teachings, are that anyone who doesn't take what's lying in front of him is a fool. If you can take it, do so. If you can attack, strike. That's the world he grew up in. So the state, in these cases, in nearly all cases, becomes a single totalitarian or autocratic leader in a small group of elites who got everything first and foremost. Okay, all the good stuff. And then whatever was left over went to the masses. Okay, that's Putin's world, what he was born into. Let's go to the next slide. So then I gained a little bit more insight into him, specifically at a conference I was working back earlier this year. I met a lady who grew up living in the same apartment building as Putin did in Leningrad, this picture you see there on the left-hand side. In that same type of, kind of really run down apartment complex that was common in the Soviet area. And Putin describes growing up in that, fighting off rats and things, really that made a mark on this guy. He grew up in poverty. She thought him to be kind of a true believer in communism and the Soviet Union, while her family and most of her friends didn't. They all kind of mouthed the words, stay out of trouble, if they thought Putin was a little bit of a different guy. But at last, he's able to climb out of this poverty and becomes an elite in the Soviet Union. He becomes a KGB officer. So that tells us a couple of things about this guy. The state found him trustworthy, and it says he's one of them. But he also has a ticket out of poverty. Now he's somebody important. Okay. Now, as Sorokin and Solzhenitsyn described, he gets a take, and as part of the KGB, he's authorized to use violence as well. He's part of the elite, so he's allowed a first foreign posting. So he goes, as luck would have it, to East Germany. And that's an interesting posting for him. East Germany, the security state there, is arguably more communistic and more paranoid than the Soviets were. Their security service, called the Stasi, they employed one full-time security officer for every 180 citizens. Think about that number. That was worse than the Soviet Union, where the ratio was probably 1 to about 600. So Putin swam in this sea of paranoia in East Germany, and likely sees the paranoia warranted since what happened when he was in the KGB. Everything collapsed. His whole system that he grew up in, that he was working in, what made him special, is on the ash heap of history. And he worked for probably the most loathed organization in the West or the Eastern Bloc, the KGB. So we all heard about how he laments the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest political disaster of the 20th century. And he's determined not to let that happen again, not to let Russia fail. So let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about Putin in Russia today. So today, you think about Putin's world now and how it impacts his thinking. So he's created and led Russia for the last 20 plus years. He's become progressively more authoritarian, more totalitarian as time goes on. Nobody really dares to contradict him anymore. And he has become the system. So you really can't imagine the country not thinking the same way that you do. Thinks you're a great leader. You can also imagine that there's nobody really else that's going to be an adequate successor to you. So it's really not about the country anymore, but it's more of an extension of Putin himself. He believes his own posters, his own propaganda. I think he's assessed the West, and he thinks that he and Russia is their target. And he frequently talks about the betrayals by the West, deceit by the West, now more so he's talking more and more about internal enemies, very much like the communists are. When Lenin and Stalin, they always spoke about some type of internal fifth column, somebody trying to overthrow the revolution or kick them out of power. He thinks the same way. He recently, not too long ago, talked about cleaning out the scum and traitors in his society. So think about the picture you see. When he invaded Ukraine, you get protests in Russia, like on the left side up there. So that is a little bit different than how we see a protest. When we see a protest in the US, we think, why are they protesting? That's not what Putin's thinking. He's thinking, who sent them? And who sent them after me? That's what he's going back to. He's thinking the Arab Spring or the color revolutions like we see on the right-hand side that took place in Ukraine when they broke away really from kind of Russian orbit. He also is rumored to watch the execution of Gaddafi when he fell numerous times. He really worries about this stuff. And he sees this as a threat to his personal survival. So he's kind of becoming a little bit more paranoid, I think, as well. And that paranoia goes out in propaganda, where a lot of folks there believe what you see as a quote below is there is a Russian or kind of an anti-Russian conspiracy out there, and everybody kind of believes it. Let's go to the next slide. So Putin also sees himself as the new great man in search of an empire. So he wants to rebuild some semblance of the Soviet Union. If you look at the map, you see what the Soviet Union was at its zenith. It was a large country that controlled a lot of the globe. Right? So he sees himself as kind of this great man in the mold of a Peter the Great or a Stalin, this tough leader who led everything when Russia was at its zenith. He wants to create a semblance of this greatness in this empire again. He also likely would like to have a buffer between him and the West, which he distrusts. So going back to his time in East Germany again, when the wall and communism fell, he noticed how the Germans reacted. Both East and West rejoiced when the wall came down. They were hugging each other in the streets. And in Ukraine, he probably assumed he would be doing something similar to that, tearing down this artificial wall between Russia and their brothers, the Ukrainians, what he considers the small Russians. He also likely thought that his troops would be welcomed in when they came in, and that really didn't turn out to be the case. Okay, not a great leap to think that he believes all of these former republics, specifically, and a lot of his former Warsaw Pact countries, think Central and Eastern Europe, owe him some type of fealty or allegiance, or at least should come to him or think about him when they make any geopolitical decisions. That's where he is. So let's go to the next slide. So why did Putin invade Ukraine? Kind of the big question. So I think, can't prove it yet, but I think in my view, Putin went into Ukraine because everything to him seemed to align at the perfect place and time. He wants to create an empire, but he needs Belarus and the Ukrainian Slavs, their brothers, and the territory that those two countries have to do that. This is the first step. Russian tradition is expansion, it's empire, and it's colonialization. Let's go to the next slide, build. Okay, so in Ukraine, what did Putin see? He sees an unpopular Jewish actor, comedian turned president, who he thought would run for the West as soon as the first bomb is dropped or first Russian troop starts moving toward Kyiv. Go to the next bill. In Europe, he saw Europe completely dependent on Russian energy. After years, get this, after years of paid and supported green initiatives and protests, Russia funded in a lot of cases, to get them off nuclear power and on his natural gas. In the West, or the US specifically, next slide, Bill, he sees weak leadership in Europe, particularly the US. He sees the US kind of tearing itself apart with these protests we had back in 2020, 21. Okay, not looking good for the West. Next slide, Bill. He saw a NATO not willing or able to defend itself. If you think about the great European power, Germany, has an air force now today that can't fly unless they cannibalize parts off one plane to get another one to fly. He's got a Navy that roughly has to do the same thing to put ships to sea. And he's got an army of less than 64,000 people, conscripted for yet less than 1 year. And if you look at what the German commander of the army said, the army that I am allowed to lead is more or less standing bare. That is not a good look when you have a guy like Putin that you're facing and your country is now energy dependent on. So not a good look for Europe and for the US at this time. Let's go to the next slide. So how goes Putin's war? So it seems Putin seriously underestimated the Ukrainian will to fight. And the leader that was lurking in this former comedian and actor called Zelensky. So Zelensky has turned into kind of a remarkable wartime leader and has modeled some incredible courage for his fellow countrymen. And they have responded to his example with similar courage. So if you think about Zelensky politically, where he was in November of 2021, he was polling about 32%. He was very unpopular, but now he's well north of 90%. Okay, and he's doing quite well. And his military, if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, has inflicted some staggering losses on the Russians as they've come in. They come in thinking they were going to go into an easy fight, and they have been, very much so surprised. So Zelensky is also kind of winning the information war for the hearts and minds of the West. And that really hasn't translated into the type and quantity of arms he really needs and the type of sanctions on Russia that really matter and are enforced across the board in the West. Still have a ways to go there. We'll talk about that more in a few minutes. So we in the West, kind of as usual, have been slow to the need. We're starting to pick up now, but we could have done a lot better earlier on. And Putin thought, I think, that Crimea or Ukraine, the attack against Ukraine would be not much like the Crimea invasion was. They would leave, it would be over very quickly, and he'd be in charge. That's not how it turned out. Let's go to the next slide. Putin also seriously underestimated the West. So he thought, much like I think the West is guilty of, he was kind of mirroring. He thought the West would do pretty much like his people do. When he says something, they respond and do as they're told. He was hoping for the same as the West. That's not what happened. Stephen Kotkin, the historian, really nails this when he described the West. He says the West is a series of institutions and values, not geography. The West is about the rule of law, democracy, private property, open markets, respect for the individual, free speech, and all the freedoms that we enjoy and far too often take for granted. That is not Russia. Okay? All of Putin's actions and crimes in Ukraine has grossly offended the West and sparked these protests and the photos you see all around the world. The Ukrainians' will to fight for their nation has revived that memory, I think, in a lot of the NATO nations, in the EU especially, and to some degree the US. NATO nations like Germany have finally decided it's time to rebuild their military. You see from the photo over on the right-hand side, from the really ridiculous, laughable shell of a force it is today, compared to what it was during the Cold War. During the Cold War, the German army alone was 600,000. It was a professional force. It was a lethal fighting force. It's not anywhere near that today. They promised to spend, like it says on the slide, about 110 billion euros to improve their military. We'll see what happens. Hopefully they will do that this time. Let's go to the next slide. I think where Putin really made his mistake was he really overestimated himself in Russia. He overestimated his own personal intelligence and political savvy, and his own intelligence services, his military, diplomatic, and economic power. He didn't get a lot of that right. And there's a reason why. The intel services in the West were very different than where they are in Russia, for example. In the West, they serve to protect the citizens and the nation, in most cases against external threats in the main. In totalitarian states like Russia, the role is really very different. It's strictly and only about regime survival. The Soviets and the Russians are very good at collecting intelligence and counterintelligence operations, but they're very, very weak in intelligence analysis. Why? Because as we saw with his intel chief picture that you see up on the upper right, he's already made his decision. Okay, so if the intelligence chief is really smart, he wants to survive in many cases, he's going to give the boss the answer the boss is expecting, right? The answer he wants. And they will continue to do so until failing, as they are in Ukraine to some degree now, becomes too much of a cost. And they have to change the way they're doing business. But right now, it's all about keeping his position, the intelligence folks, and keeping their heads. He didn't listen to his intelligence folks. Okay, his intel in his military system, also they made some mistakes that are common across the globe, and we do it ourselves. If you understand the enemy, the Ukrainians, for example, you only understand about half the puzzle. You really have to understand yourself. He has to understand what his own military is capable of and how those two things will interact, the Ukrainian military and the Russian military. He didn't get that right. His folks didn't get that right. And it's caused a problem for him. He's learning, sadly for him, that, marching your army through Red Square on a parade is vastly different than fighting somebody who was determined to defend their country. And he's learning that lesson right now. Let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about the Ukrainian military situation. Ukraine's been kind of a remarkable study, and it's been very, very interesting how they're doing now. So over the years, the last 8 years since the invasion of Crimea back in 2014, the Ukrainians have welcomed and absorbed years of US and NATO training. In addition, the Ukrainians have been very smart about their ongoing war that's been over in the what we call the Donbass, the eastern part. They've rotated about 400,000 soldiers in and out of that fight over the years. So they've gained a lot of invaluable combat experience. So those guys and gals in the cities now that are fighting are very competent, and they have high morale, and they're good fighters. And they've latched onto the fact that warfare, especially urban warfare, is kind of a squad fight, that you can't wait for the general to tell you to do something like the Russians do. They have to do it on their own, and they've absorbed that, and they're doing it, and they're making the Russians pay a heavy price. So a lot of this NATO equipment that you see in the pictures here, the Javelin missile up on the top right, and the HIMARS system, this rocket launching system, has made a big impact, but they don't have enough of it yet. This type of combat is very, very high intensity, and it absorbs a lot of equipment. So we've given them about 5,500 Javelin missiles. The US only produces 1,000 of those a year. That's how fast we're going through this. HIMARS the same way. We've given them about 400,000 artillery rounds, but they use about 6,000 to 10,000 of those a day. So that's the type of expenditure we're talking about. It's very, very consuming. Let's go to the next slide. Russian military situation, not really going well for them. They started off, let's take a quick case study up in the north when they attacked into Kyiv. They really led with conscript soldiers, as hard as that is to believe, and they were facing combat veterans. And the Russian military was savaged by those combat Ukrainian veterans. They really took it to them. And that's why that whole situation in north attacking into the Kyiv area failed. And it was a lot of urban combat. And again, that's the toughest part of combat. Urban combat in the main takes the US about 2 years to train a soldier, an infantryman, and squad to fight effectively and survive. If you can't do that, you don't have the time to do that, you're going to fail. And they led with conscripts who have in the main less than a year of training, and they put them in this fight. So about 15 years ago, the Russian military embarked on this reform and modernization campaign. It really didn't pay off for them like they thought it would. Their equipment, especially their tanks and their APCs or armored personnel carriers, all have a fatal flaw. If you look at the picture on the right, you notice vehicles with big holes in them. That's where the turret used to be. So what happens is they store their ammunition inside the turret, inside the crew compartment of the vehicle. So any penetration, you get what we call a catastrophic kill. The turret flies off, it blows up, it kills everybody in the vehicle. So it's just horrible. Logistics, very tough. Also, you saw a lot of pictures of these big convoys of parked Russian vehicles that hit and were open to attack by the Ukrainians. Logistics is the toughest part of war, and they can't get it right. It takes the US division, if you think about what the daunting tasks they were facing. A US division in the attack takes or consumes about 500,000 gallons of fuel a day. That's just fuel. Think about ammunition, food, water, medical, all those things. And they don't have a professional logistics force, clearly, because they were failing their guys. You have a lot of vehicles and things just abandoned and left on the field because they didn't have the ability to supply it and move it. Also, all these super weapons that we heard so much about the news don't appear to be all that super. Ukrainian aircraft still fly. Russia Air Force hasn't been able to dominate the space. They're forced now to launch their weapons from from Russian or from Belarus airspace. It's not flying over Ukrainian forces. Let's go to the next slide. So who's winning? Hard to say. Time kind of works against both sides, against Ukraine, but also to a lesser degree Russia. The longer this thing drags on, the more damage is done to Putin's economy. So think about all the high-end military equipment, that missile system up on the upper left that he has lost. He's launched thousands of those things, probably 2,000 into Ukraine. How does he replace those with the damage that's been done to his economy? The military vehicles, the tanks, the APCs that you see in the lower slide there, how does he replace those? He's lost possibly 1,500 tanks or more. He's trying to get volunteer units to come from the far east of Russia, giving them about a month of training and try to send them to this level of combat against a very competent military, the Ukrainians. He's also sending obsolete equipment in now because all of his high-end stuff has been destroyed already. Time works against Ukraine, so they're fighting for survival. And I've got a picture there of Mariupol, one of the cities in the east. The picture on the left-hand side and the results after the fight on the right-hand side. So the question for Ukraine is, if they stick it out longer, maybe they can get a more just peace and they can retain a lot more of their land, their sovereignty, but at what cost? How many more cities like Mariupol have to be destroyed? How many lives are lost as we go through this? It's just not good. Let's go to the next slide. So who's winning? I took this picture you have on the left-hand side was from July. That shows you where Russian forces were. The one on the right, that is where they are today. So Russia now is pretty much on the defensive. They're attacking in some local areas, but in the main, they've been pushed back up in the north near the Kharkiv area, near the Donetsk area. They've been pushed back a lot. And really down in the southern piece toward the west, just north of Crimea, near the town of Kherson, they've lost a lot of territory. They've been pushed back and stopped there. So in the main now, looks like Ukraine's making a pretty good offensive march to push these guys back. Now, does Ukraine have all they need or the ability to push Russia out? Probably not anytime soon, I would think. It's going to be a matter of this thing is kind of going into a stalemate where each side is going to be doing a little movement here and there, attacking where they can, but they really don't have the ability to either eject the Ukrainians out of the part Russia wants to keep, or the Ukrainians to eject Russia out of their country in general. They just don't have the gas in the tank left to do that. So let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about the information war. This is kind of one of my pet peeves. Who's winning the information war? Well, it's not us. And I'll tell you why. There's a lot of media hype about every time Putin makes a statement about these new invincible weapons he has, vacuum bombs, hypersonics, hybrid warfare, escalate to de-escalate, kind of blah, blah, blah. Let's talk about a couple of these things, though, in red. So no-fly zones and nuclear weapons. So his talk about nukes, it should give us pause. We should take that seriously, and it should make us think, but it should make us blink. Okay, he has so much to lose at virtually every level if he takes that path. And that's something he needs to hear frequently from us. We need to tell him that. Okay, remember the purpose of his regime structure. It's about his personal survival, and nuking anyone would put that in significant jeopardy. And he knows that. And we need to remind him of that frequently. Get the word to him behind the scenes. You don't have to do it in public. All right. No fly zones, another tough one, because that would put us in direct conflict with Russia. Do we really want to do that, for a non-NATO member? He's launching his cruise missiles mainly from external to Ukraine anyway, so I'm not sure that would do too much for us. But Julian Lindley French, another historian, has a great question that we should ask our leaders in NATO. And the question is this: what is the reason NATO is reluctant to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine? Is it about the ability or utility of such a campaign, or because the strategic culture in Western Europe is now so weak that making Eastern European allies live with the risk Putin poses is better than confronting Moscow under virtually any circumstances? If it is the latter, then NATO is in real trouble. And I think that's where we are. We listen to his rhetoric so much and his threats, and we don't realize that he's really driving that car. We go back to the little green Zhiguli. His military is not nearly as competent as we thought. Ukraine is giving him a beating, and he knows that. So NATO needs to become a legitimate defense force again. I think that will be the biggest help. We're all contribute, as opposed to what we have right now, which is kind of a quaint club that the US is really the only member that really matters from a military perspective. Europe needs skin in the game, and 2% of their GDP going toward their defense is really what they should be doing. All right, we'll skip some of the other things and we'll just get into your questions in a few minutes. Let's go to the last slide and just kind of some ideas about how the West should respond to, I think the one previous to that, Elliot. Okay, there we go. So the first thing is we need to be proactive and not reactive to this guy. So he not demonstrably answering clear breaches of international norms or crimes only embolden a totalitarian. We've seen that throughout history. We never seem to learn the lesson. They understand power, violence, and getting their way. And they don't respond to verbal admonishments or diplomatic demarches. Okay, that to them is weakness. And weakness invites exploitation, which we've seen him do throughout the last 20 years almost. In essence, they're bullies, and like all bullies, if you stand up to them, they very often back down. That's what we need to do. I think another thing we can do is just shut up and stop telling the Russians what we won't do or what we will do. There needs to be some mystery there, and not let him know or think that we're going to back down all the time. We just can't do that. And we need to cease amplifying Russian propaganda. Every time he comes out with a new weapon or whatever, we don't need to go out and throw up our arms and scream that we're about to lose everything. That's not the case. And stop acting and seeking Putin's permission. We don't need to ask his permission to do anything to supply Ukrainians or give them things they really need to make a difference in the fight. Okay, give the Ukrainians what they need, not what won't offend Putin. We don't have to do it in the open, do it clandestinely. You don't have to do everything out on TV. Just do it in a matter that's going to make him guess for change about what we're doing and worry about what we do. He should stay awake at night worrying about what the West is going to do to him, as opposed to all the time us reacting to what he does and worrying about it. And the last one I'll leave you with is an energy strategy. Okay, I'm all for green, renewable, and all that. I drive a hybrid car, recycling's great, but renewable world is 30 years away at best. And it's not going to happen by going solar or doing wind. It's just not going to happen. The only thing that's really going to work for us is nuclear. And remember what he tried to do. He tried to get everybody in Europe off of nuclear to buy his natural gas, so he would have control over them. And he was very successful. And until we understand that and start acting on it, we're going to continue to face this problem. And also, finally, just what we said on the previous slide, NATO needs to get real about defense. 2% is the entry fee, and they should face a penalty if they can't do that, like everybody else does. All right. That's it. I'll turn it over to you guys for questions. I think we have a few minutes left.
Thank you so much, Ken. That was great. I think that a couple of the questions have related to elaborating a bit more about the West and NATO's part in that. So
Okay.
you used Stephen Kotkin's very good definition, but if you just break that down a little bit, what does the West mean right now? And that I think will help. We have an age range going from 6th grade up
Okay.
among the students.
I think for us, the West, in my view, is kind of what Kochen laid out, is that we are a system, a group of countries that have a set of values that we try to live by. Has the US always lived by our values and done things the right way? Not always. No country's ever going to do that. But in the norm, in general, we do. We follow a set of rules. We have the rule of law that people aspire to and want to come to. That's why we have so many people trying to come into our country. They see us as different. They see us as value, that we are a value-based society that they want to join because they're coming from places like Russia that are not, where the individual really doesn't matter. It's all about keeping the people at the top well-fed, clothed, and getting everything they want at the expense of everybody else. And I think that'd be the best way to describe it.
Thank you. And we have only about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to switch to a specific question for your remaining time. As you talked about, there's an energy strategy that Vladimir Putin is trying to put into effect. And he very recently, again, I mean, it's not the first time, he's threatened to cut off all energy to Western Europe. How should right now in the fall, not 30 years from now, but how should right now in the fall, Western Europe and the United States respond? So in other words, how should the West and NATO respond?
I think we in the US, we have the ability to produce enough energy for ourselves and for Western Europe. It's natural gas and it's petroleum products. So we were doing that up until about 2 years ago. And then we switched over. Think about the insanity of this. What NATO stands for is against the threat of a Russia, but yet we're going to buy all of our oil and gas from him and kill off like the Germans did. Most people don't realize Germany had nuclear power plants that they were running and providing their country with all the energy needs they really needed. And they gave it all away. So now they're stuck buying nuclear energy from France or Russia natural gas to heat themselves in the wintertime. That's insanity. You're funding Russia's military, basically. You've given him the money to create his military through the petrochemical stuff that you're buying from the guy. We were guilty of the same thing. We were buying 700,000 barrels of oil and petroleum products a year from Russia after producing our own. That makes no sense to me. We've got to get it back to a reasonable policy where the US is supplying the allies who have the same values instead of buying it from the guy you're supporting to do the terrible things he's doing in Ukraine and around the world.
Thank you. Ken Pope, Director of Academic Programs at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, for tackling and explaining a very difficult and, of course, one of the most timely topics. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.